Danny is innocent, set her free.
She was 82 years old, standing in a courtroom, accused of tax fraud she never committed. But before the judge could send her to prison, two 10-year-old girls stood up and did something that would change everything. What happened next shocked everyone in that courtroom, including the judge himself. This is the story of Beatrice Washington, a woman who spent her entire life building something from nothing, only to watch it nearly crumble in a single day. But more than that, this is the story of her granddaughters, Zara and Nola, and how their courage reminded an entire courtroom what justice really means. Let me take you back to where it all began. Beatrice Washington was born in 1942 in rural Georgia, the daughter of sharecroppers who barely had enough to feed their children. She learned early that the world wasn't designed for people who looked like her. Her parents told her that education was the only way out, the only weapon they could give her in a world that would rather keep her down. So Beatrice studied. She studied by candlelight when there was no electricity. She walked 6 miles to the colored school when the white children rode past her in buses. She memorized every lesson, every word, because she knew that knowledge was the one thing nobody could take from her. By the time she was 18, Beatrice had earned a scholarship to a historically black college, one of only 3 students from her entire county to do so. She studied accounting, working 3 jobs to pay for books and supplies the scholarship didn't cover. She graduated top of her class in 1964, right in the middle of the civil rights movement, right when the world was supposedly changing. But change was slow. Beatrice applied to 47 accounting firms in Atlanta. 47 rejection letters came back. Some were polite. Most weren't. One simply said, "We don't hire your kind." She kept every letter in a folder, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of what she was fighting against. So Beatrice did what so many before her had done. She started her own business. Washington and Associates Tax Services opened in 1966 in a tiny storefront in a predominantly black neighborhood in Atlanta. She had 3 clients that first year. 3 people who trusted her with their hard-earned money, their financial futures, their dreams. Beatrice treated each client like they were her only client. She stayed up late reviewing every deduction, every form, making sure everything was perfect. Because she knew that one mistake, one error, and people would say it was because of who she was, not just what she'd done. Over the next 56 years, Beatrice built her small firm into a thriving business. She hired other black accountants, giving them opportunities the big firms wouldn't. She offered free tax preparation services to elderly residents who couldn't afford help. She became a pillar of her community, the person people turned to when they needed financial advice, when they needed someone they could trust. She married Harold Washington in 1968. They had one daughter, Michelle, who grew up watching her mother work tirelessly, watching her father support her mother's dreams. Michelle became a teacher, dedicated to education the same way her mother had been. In 2010, Michelle had twin daughters. She named them Zara and Nola, and Beatrice became the grandmother she'd always dreamed of being. But in 2019, tragedy struck. Michelle and her husband were killed in a car accident, hit by a drunk driver on their way home from a parent-teacher conference. Beatrice, at 77 years old, became the primary guardian of 2 9-year-old girls who had just lost everything. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She closed her business temporarily, reorganized her entire life, and dedicated herself to raising Zara and Nola. She enrolled them in a good school, made sure they had counseling to deal with their trauma, tucked them in every night and told them stories about their mother, about strength, about perseverance. The girls were different in many ways. Zara was the quieter one, introspective, always reading, always thinking. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's determination. Nola was louder, more expressive, quick to laugh and quick to cry. She wore her heart on her sleeve and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. But they shared one thing, an absolute devotion to their grandmother, the woman who had picked up the pieces of their shattered world and put them back together with love and patience. By 2022, Beatrice had reopened Washington and Associates, working part-time while still prioritizing her granddaughters. At 80 years old, she was slowing down, but her mind was still sharp, her dedication still unwavering. She had nearly 200 clients, most of them small business owners, working families, people who trusted her implicitly. But Beatrice had a problem she didn't fully understand. Her longtime assistant, Gerald Hartley, had been with her for 15 years. She'd hired him when he was fresh out of college, trained him herself, trusted him to handle client accounts when she couldn't. Gerald was a 42-year-old white man who had always seemed competent, professional, grateful for the opportunity Beatrice had given him. What Beatrice didn't know was that Gerald had been living beyond his means. He'd made bad investments, racked up gambling debts, and was desperate. So he'd started skimming money from client accounts, small amounts at first, then larger ones. And when the IRS started investigating, Gerald did something unthinkable. He altered records to make it look like Beatrice was responsible. He created false documents with her signature, backdated files, and when the IRS came knocking, he pointed them straight at his elderly employer. The investigation started in January 2024. Beatrice couldn't understand it. IRS agents showed up at her office with questions about discrepancies in client accounts, about unreported income, about fraudulent deductions. She insisted there must be some mistake. She'd been meticulous her entire career. She showed them her records, her files, everything she had. But Gerald had been clever. The documents he'd created looked legitimate. The signatures looked real because he'd practiced forging them. And when the IRS interviewed him, he played the part of the concerned employee who'd only recently discovered his employer's wrongdoing. The case moved quickly, too quickly. The prosecution was aggressive, painting Beatrice as a woman who'd used her trusted position in the community to defraud clients and the government. They claimed she'd embezzled over $400,000 over a 3-year period. The evidence Gerald had manufactured seemed damning. Beatrice hired a lawyer, but legal defense is expensive, and she'd already spent most of her savings raising Zara and Nola. Her lawyer did his best, but he was overworked, underpaid, and up against a prosecution team that had unlimited resources and a judge who seemed to have already made up his mind. Judge Randall Blackwood was 65 years old, and he'd been on the bench for 23 years. He had a reputation for being tough on crime, for handing down harsh sentences, for believing that the law was the law and mercy was weakness. He was a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He'd grown up wealthy, attended prestigious schools, never had to struggle for anything in his life. And while he would never admit it, not even to himself, he carried certain assumptions about certain people. When Beatrice's case came before him, Judge Blackwood saw what he expected to see: another case of fraud, another defendant trying to claim innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The fact that she was an 82-year-old black woman who'd built a business from nothing, who'd served her community for decades, who'd raised her granddaughters after tragedy struck, none of that mattered to him. Evidence was evidence. The law was the law. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Beatrice sat in that courtroom every day, dressed in her best clothes, maintaining her dignity even as the prosecution tore apart her reputation. Zara and Nola sat behind her, 2 10-year-old girls watching their grandmother being called a criminal, a fraud, a thief. They didn't fully understand everything being said, but they understood enough. They understood that people were trying to take away the one person they had left. The prosecution presented Gerald's manufactured evidence. They brought in witnesses who testified about discrepancies in their accounts, though none of them believed Beatrice was responsible. They painted a picture of a woman who'd taken advantage of her client's trust, who'd used her position to steal. Beatrice's lawyer tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. He pointed out inconsistencies, questioned the authenticity of documents, suggested that someone else could be responsible. But he couldn't prove it. He didn't have the resources for forensic document analysis, for digital forensics experts, for the kind of investigation that might have uncovered Gerald's deception. Gerald testified, playing the part of the reluctant witness, the employee who'd been deceived by his employer. He was convincing. He looked the judge in the eye and lied with the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. And through it all, Judge Blackwood watched with those cold blue eyes, occasionally taking notes, his expression never changing. When Beatrice took the stand in her own defense, he listened without any visible emotion as she explained her career, her dedication to her clients, her confusion about these accusations. When she talked about raising her granddaughters, about losing her daughter, about building her business despite decades of discrimination, his expression remained neutral, unmoved. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they came back, their verdict was guilty on all counts. Beatrice sat perfectly still as the verdict was read. Behind her, Zara and Nola grabbed each other's hands, tears streaming down their faces. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Some people couldn't believe it. Others weren't surprised. That's how the system worked sometimes. That's how it had always worked. Judge Blackwood scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. Federal sentencing guidelines for tax fraud of this magnitude suggested a prison sentence of 5 to 7 years. For an 82-year-old woman, that was essentially a life sentence. Those 2 weeks were the hardest of Beatrice's life. She tried to stay strong for her granddaughters, tried to maintain her routine, but the weight of what was coming crushed her. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about dying in prison, thinking about Zara and Nola going into foster care, thinking about how everything she'd built, everything she'd worked for, had crumbled so quickly. Zara and Nola noticed the change in their grandmother. She smiled less. She seemed smaller somehow, as if the verdict had physically diminished her. They tried to cheer her up, brought her drawings, told her jokes, crawled into bed with her at night like they used to when they first came to live with her. One night, about a week before sentencing, Zara and Nola were supposed to be asleep. But they were both lying awake, thinking about what was going to happen to their grandmother, to them, to everything. Nola spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. "Zara, what if we lose her too?" Zara didn't answer right away. She was the older twin by 12 minutes, and she'd always felt responsible for her sister, especially after their parents died. She tried to be strong, tried to hold it together, but she was scared too. She was just a 10-year-old girl who'd already lost too much. "We won't," Zara finally said, but her voice shook. "But what if we do? What if the judge sends her to prison and we never see her again? What if we have to go live with strangers?" "That's not going to happen." "How do you know?" "Because Grandma didn't do anything wrong. You know that." "I know that. Everyone who really knows her knows that. But the jury said she was guilty. The judge is going to send her to prison." Zara sat up in bed, and Nola could see her sister's silhouette in the darkness. "Then we have to do something." "What can we do? We're just kids. Mom used to tell us that being small doesn't mean being powerless. She said that people have changed the world by standing up and telling the truth, even when everyone else wanted them to be quiet. But who's going to listen to us? I don't know. But we have to try. We can't just let them take her away without fighting." The next morning, Zara and Nola started their own investigation. They were 10 years old with no legal training, no resources, no power, but they had something else. They knew their grandmother was innocent, and they were desperate enough to do whatever it took to prove it. They started by going through Beatrice's home office while she was out. They looked at old files, old records, anything they could find. They didn't really know what they were looking for, but they knew something was wrong, something didn't add up. Nola found a box of old client files in the basement, records from before Gerald had started working for their grandmother. She noticed something. The handwriting was different. Beatrice's handwriting was neat, precise, the writing of someone who'd been taught proper penmanship and took pride in their work. But some of the newer documents, the ones that were supposedly Beatrice's, had slightly different handwriting. The letters were formed differently, the spacing was off. "Zara, look at this," Nola said, spreading documents across the floor. "These signatures don't match." Zara compared them carefully. She'd always been good with details, with noticing things others missed. "You're right. They're similar, but they're not the same. Someone tried to copy Grandma's signature, but they didn't do it perfectly. Do you think someone framed her?" "I think Gerald did it." "Mr. Hartley? But he's worked for Grandma forever. Why would he do that?" "I don't know, but we need to find out." The girls spent the next few days gathering evidence. They compared dozens of documents, noting the differences in handwriting and signatures. They found old emails that showed Gerald had access to all of Beatrice's accounts and files. They discovered that some of the supposedly fraudulent transactions had occurred on days when Beatrice had documented appointments elsewhere. Medical records, receipts, calendar entries that proved she couldn't have been the one making those transactions. But they were just two kids with a pile of papers. They didn't know how to get anyone to listen to them. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. The sentencing was scheduled for 3 days away. Zara had an idea. "We need to go to the courthouse. We need to talk to the judge." "They won't let us talk to the judge. He's probably already decided what he's going to do." "Then we'll make him listen. We'll bring our evidence. We'll show him that Grandma is innocent." "Zara, he's not going to care what two kids think." "Maybe not. But we have to try. What else can we do?" The day of sentencing arrived. It was a cold February morning, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and won't let go. Beatrice dressed carefully, putting on her best suit, the navy blue one she'd worn to her daughter's funeral. She did her makeup, fixed her hair, maintained her dignity even though she felt like she was preparing for her own funeral. Zara and Nola dressed carefully too, in matching dresses their grandmother had bought them for special occasions. But hidden in Zara's backpack was all the evidence they'd gathered, every document, every comparison, every piece of proof they'd found. They arrived at the courthouse early. The building was massive, imposing, all concrete and glass and power. People rushed past them, lawyers in expensive suits, court officers, people who looked important and busy. Beatrice held her granddaughter's hands as they walked through security, as they rode the elevator to the fourth floor, as they entered the courtroom where her fate would be decided. The courtroom was already filling up. Some of Beatrice's former clients were there, people who still believed in her innocence. Members of her church had come to support her. But there were also people there who believed the verdict, who thought she was guilty, who'd come to see justice served. Beatrice sat at the defense table with her lawyer. Zara and Nola sat directly behind her, close enough to touch her shoulder, to remind her they were there. The prosecutor sat across the aisle, looking confident, satisfied. This was a win for him, another conviction, another criminal put away. At exactly 9 o'clock the bailiff called out, "All rise." The Honorable Judge Randall Blackwood presiding. Everyone stood as Judge Blackwood entered. He was wearing his black robes, carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd been making life-altering decisions for over 2 decades. He sat down, arranged his papers, and looked out at the courtroom with those cold blue eyes. "Please be seated," he said, his voice carrying through the room without needing to be raised. "We're here for sentencing in the matter of United States versus Beatrice Washington. Will the defendant please rise?" Beatrice stood, her lawyer standing beside her. She held her head high, maintained her composure, refused to let them see her break. Judge Blackwood began his sentencing remarks. "Mrs. Washington, you've been convicted by a jury of your peers of multiple counts of tax fraud and embezzlement. The evidence presented at trial showed a pattern of deliberate deception over several years, resulting in significant financial harm to your clients and to the government." Beatrice's hands trembled slightly, but she kept them clasped in front of her, kept her expression neutral. "The prosecution has recommended a sentence of 7 years in federal prison, and I am inclined to agree. While I acknowledge your age and your previous contributions to your community, the severity of these crimes and the breach of trust they represent demand significant consequences." Behind Beatrice, Zara and Nola were holding hands so tightly their fingers were white. Tears were streaming down both their faces, but they were trying to be quiet, trying not to disrupt the proceedings. Judge Blackwood continued, "Before I pass sentence, the law allows the defendant or any representatives to make a final statement. Mrs. Washington, do you have anything you wish to say?" Beatrice's lawyer started to stand, but before he could speak, Zara stood up. Her voice cracked as she said, "I have something to say." The entire courtroom went silent. Judge Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Young lady, these proceedings are not—" "Please," Zara interrupted, her voice stronger now. "Please, Your Honor. Just let me speak. Let us speak. We have evidence." Nola stood up beside her sister, her hand reaching into Zara's backpack, pulling out the folder they'd prepared. Judge Blackwood looked irritated. "This is highly irregular. The trial is over. The verdict has been delivered. This is a sentencing hearing, not—" "Then let this be part of the sentencing," Zara said, her voice ringing through the courtroom with a clarity that shocked everyone present. "You're about to send our grandmother to prison for something she didn't do. The least you can do is listen to what we have to say." People in the gallery were murmuring. The prosecutor started to object, but Judge Blackwood held up his hand. He was staring at these 2 10-year-old girls, these children who had just interrupted a federal sentencing with a confidence that bordered on audacity. There was something in their eyes, something in the way they stood there, trembling but determined, that made him pause. Maybe it reminded him of his own grandchildren. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe, deep down, beneath all his years of case law and courtroom procedure, there was still a spark of human decency that recognized desperation when he saw it. "You have 2 minutes, Judge Blackwood said finally. Make it count." Zara stepped forward, holding the folder. Nola was right beside her. They walked to the front of the courtroom, standing at the defense table next to their grandmother, who was looking at them with a mixture of fear and pride. Zara opened the folder with shaking hands. "Your Honor, our names are Zara and Nola Johnson. Beatrice Washington is our grandmother. She's raised us since our parents died 3 years ago. She's the only family we have left." Nola continued, her voice breaking, "We're not lawyers. We don't know all the legal stuff. But we know our grandmother. We know she didn't do what they said she did." "The evidence," the prosecutor started, but Judge Blackwood silenced him with a look. "Go on," he said to the girls. Zara pulled out the first set of documents. "These are signatures from before Mr. Hartley started working for our grandmother. This is how she actually signs her name." She held up the papers high enough for the judge to see. "And these are the signatures on the documents that were used to convict her. They're different. Someone forged them." She approached the bench, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. A court officer moved to stop her, but Judge Blackwood waved him back. Zara handed him the documents. Judge Blackwood put on his reading glasses and examined the papers. His expression didn't change, but he was looking carefully, comparing the signatures. Nola spoke up. We also found that some of the transactions happened on days when our grandmother was somewhere else. She keeps a calendar. She saves receipts. She was at doctor's appointments, at our school events, at church functions. We have proof she wasn't even in the office when some of this stuff supposedly happened. Zara pulled out more documents. Medical appointment confirmations, time-stamped photos from school events, church bulletin printouts with Beatrice's name listed as attending. Mr. Hartley had access to all of her accounts. He had her passwords. He could have done all of this and made it look like she did it. The prosecutor was standing now. Your Honor, this is absurd. These children have had weeks to manufacture. These aren't manufactured, Zara said, her voice sharp, angry now. We found these in our grandmother's files. She keeps everything. She's always been careful, always kept good records, because she knew people would be looking for any reason to say she did something wrong. There was something in the way Zara said that last part that hit Judge Blackwood like a punch. She was 10 years old, and she already understood that her grandmother had to work twice as hard, be twice as careful, because of who she was. She'd probably grown up hearing stories about it, watching it, living it. Nola was crying now, but she kept talking. Mr. Hartley testified against our grandmother. He said she did all these bad things. But why would he have access to everything if he wasn't supposed to be able to do these transactions? And if our grandmother was doing something wrong, why would she keep all these records that prove she was somewhere else when it happened? Judge Blackwood was quiet, still examining the documents. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Nola's quiet sobbing. Zara took a deep breath. Your Honor, we know the trial is over. We know you've probably already decided what you're going to do. But our grandmother has already lost her daughter, our mother. She's already lost her business, her reputation, everything she spent her whole life building. And we've already lost our parents. If you send her to prison, we lose her too. And maybe that doesn't matter to you. Maybe you think the law is more important than a family. But we thought someone should at least know the truth before you decided. She was crying now too, tears streaming down her face, but she kept her eyes on the judge. Our grandmother taught us that you should always fight for what's right, even when it's hard, even when everyone tells you you can't win. So that's what we're doing. We're fighting for her because she spent her whole life fighting for us. The two girls stood there holding each other, crying, waiting. Beatrice was crying too, silent tears running down her face as she looked at her granddaughters, these incredible children who loved her enough to stand up in front of a federal judge and demand justice. Judge Blackwood was still looking at the documents. His expression was unreadable. Finally he looked up, not at the girls but at the prosecutor. Mr. Chin, have these signature discrepancies been examined by a forensic document analyst? The prosecutor hesitated. Your Honor, the signatures were authenticated during discovery by. I asked if they were examined by a forensic document analyst. A handwriting expert. Someone who specializes in detecting forgeries. The investigating agents compared them and found them to be consistent enough. That's not what I asked. The prosecutor's confidence was wavering. No, Your Honor. A forensic document analyst was not consulted. Judge Blackwood turned to Beatrice's lawyer. Counselor, did you request a forensic examination of these signatures during the trial? The lawyer looked uncomfortable. Your Honor, the budget for Mrs. Washington's defense was extremely limited. A qualified forensic document analyst cost several $1,000s and... So no one actually verified these signatures with an expert, Judge Blackwood said. It wasn't a question. He looked back at the documents the girls had provided, then at the alibis they'd compiled. Then he looked at Gerald Hartley, who was sitting in the back of the courtroom, looking increasingly nervous. Mr. Hartley, Judge Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Please approach the bench. Gerald stood slowly. He looked like he wanted to run, but where could he go? Every eye in the courtroom was on him as he walked forward. Mr. Hartley, you testified during the trial that you were Mrs. Washington's assistant for 15 years, is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you had access to her accounts, her files, her passwords? Well, yes, but only because... Did you have access to her signature stamp? Gerald's face went pale. I don't. It's a simple question, Mr. Hartley. Did you have access to Mrs. Washington's signature stamp, the one she used for routine documents? I may have, but... Yes or no? Yes. Judge Blackwood leaned forward. Mr. Hartley, These children have just presented evidence suggesting that someone forged Mrs. Washington's signature on key documents. They've also provided evidence that Mrs. Washington was provably elsewhere when some of these transactions occurred. You had the access, the opportunity, and according to these bank records the defense has just provided, you also had a significant gambling problem and substantial debt during the time period in question. The courtroom erupted. People were talking, shouting. The prosecutor was objecting. Beatrice's lawyer was standing, looking stunned. And Gerald Hartley was backing away from the bench, his face red, his hands shaking. "Your Honor, I don't have to listen to this," Gerald said, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. Two kids show up with some papers and suddenly—" "Mr. Hartley, I suggest you remain silent and contact an attorney," Judge Blackwood said coldly. "Bailiff, please ensure Mr. Hartley doesn't leave the courthouse." Two court officers moved to Gerald's position. He looked like he was going to run, but where could he go? He was trapped, cornered by the truth that two 10-year-old girls had uncovered. Judge Blackwood turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Chin, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into Gerald Hartley's finances and his access to Mrs. Washington's accounts during the relevant time period. I'm also ordering a forensic examination of all signatures on the documents used to convict Mrs. Washington. Until that investigation is complete, I'm postponing this sentencing indefinitely." The prosecutor tried to object, but Judge Blackwood cut him off. "This isn't optional, counselor. If there's even a possibility that this woman has been wrongly convicted because your office failed to properly investigate an alternative suspect, that's a miscarriage of justice I won't allow to stand." He looked at Beatrice, who was staring at him in disbelief. "Mrs. Washington, you're remanded to house arrest pending the outcome of this investigation. You'll wear an ankle monitor, but you'll be home with your granddaughters. This court is adjourned." He banged his gavel and the courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters were rushing out to file stories. Beatrice's former clients were crying, hugging each other. Beatrice collapsed into her chair, sobbing, while Zara and Nola threw their arms around her. The prosecutor was furious, his face red as he argued with his assistants. Gerald Hartley was being questioned by court officers, his story already falling apart under scrutiny. And Judge Blackwood sat at his bench, watching it all, looking at those two little girls who'd had the courage to stand up and demand justice. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Once they started looking at Gerald Hartley with suspicious eyes, everything unraveled. Forensic document analysts confirmed that the signatures on the key documents were forgeries, good forgeries, but forgeries nonetheless. Digital forensics experts traced the fraudulent transactions back to Gerald's computer, showing that he'd been carefully skimming money for over 3 years. They found his gambling debts, his desperate financial situation, the way he'd systematically framed Beatrice to cover his own crimes. They found communications with bookies, with loan sharks, with people he owed money to. They found the fake email accounts he'd created, the backdated documents, the manipulated records. Gerald tried to maintain his innocence, but the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, faced with incontrovertible proof, he confessed. He confessed to everything: the embezzlement, the forgery, the frame-up. He thought he was clever, thought he could pin it all on his elderly black employer and no one would question it too closely. He'd counted on people's biases, on their assumptions, on the fact that Beatrice Washington was an easier target than he was. 2 months after that courtroom scene, Beatrice Washington walked back into a federal courthouse. But this time it wasn't for her sentencing. It was for the formal dismissal of all charges against her. Judge Blackwood presided over that hearing too. He looked different somehow, older maybe, or perhaps just more aware of his own fallibility. When Beatrice stood before him, he didn't just dismiss the charges. He apologized. "Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice carrying through the courtroom, "I failed you. This court failed you. The system failed you. You stood before me innocent of these crimes, and I was prepared to send you to prison because I trusted a process that was flawed, evidence that was falsified, and an investigation that was incomplete." Beatrice stood quietly listening. "I'd like to say that I would have caught these discrepancies eventually, but I'm not sure that's true. I'd like to say that I would have ordered a more thorough investigation before sentencing, but I don't know if I would have. What I do know is that your granddaughters had the courage to stand up and demand justice when every adult in this room, including me, was ready to let an injustice occur." He looked at Zara and Nola, who were sitting in the front row, holding hands. "Young ladies, you showed me something I'd forgotten after 23 years on this bench. You showed me that justice isn't just about following procedures and precedents. It's about seeking the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it challenges our assumptions, even when it means admitting we were wrong. Zara and Nola were crying again, but this time they were tears of relief, of joy, of vindication. Judge Blackwood continued, "Mrs. Washington, on behalf of this court, I offer you my sincere apology. All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be brought again. Your record will be expunged. I'm also ordering that you be compensated for your legal fees and for the damage to your reputation and business." He paused, then added, "I'm also personally committing to reviewing sentencing procedures in this court to ensure that we're not just hearing the evidence, but truly seeking the truth behind it." Beatrice nodded, accepting his words with grace. She didn't say much, just a quiet thank you. What else was there to say? She'd been vindicated, but she'd also been through hell. She'd spent months believing she would die in prison, months watching her granddaughters suffer, months seeing her life's work destroyed. Gerald Hartley was convicted of all charges: embezzlement, fraud, forgery, perjury. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, the exact sentence Judge Blackwood had been prepared to give Beatrice. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. But the story doesn't end in that courtroom. It ends 6 months later on a warm summer day. Beatrice had reopened Washington and Associates, though she was taking on fewer clients now, working part-time, spending more time with her granddaughters. Many of her former clients came back, their faith in her restored. New clients came too, people who'd heard her story who wanted to support her. The media attention had been intense. Zara and Nola's courage had captured national headlines. 10-year-olds save grandmother from prison, the headlines read. They were interviewed on local news, featured in national magazines, hailed as heroes. But to Beatrice they were just her granddaughters, the 2 little girls she loved more than anything in the world. On this particular summer day, Beatrice took Zara and Nola to their mother's grave. They hadn't been since the trial, since everything had happened. It was time. They stood there, the 3 of them, looking at Michelle's headstone. Beatrice placed fresh flowers, bright yellow sunflowers that had been Michelle's favorite. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Beatrice said quietly, her arms around both girls. "She always told you that you had voices that deserved to be heard, that you should stand up for what's right. You did that. You saved me. You saved our family." Zara leaned into her grandmother. "We just told the truth." "That's all you should ever have to do," Beatrice said. "That's all any of us should ever have to do. But sometimes the truth isn't enough unless you have the courage to fight for it." Nola looked up at her grandmother. "Grandma, were you scared? When the judge was about to send you to prison, were you scared?" Beatrice thought about lying, about protecting them from the truth, but these girls had earned honesty. They'd fought for the truth, they deserved the truth. "Yes, baby. I was terrified. I was scared I'd never see you again, that you'd grow up without me, that I'd die in a cell somewhere. I was scared that everything your mother and I had taught you about justice and fairness was a lie." "But it wasn't a lie," Zara said firmly. "Justice happened. Maybe it almost didn't, but it did." Beatrice smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Justice happened because you fought for it. Because you refused to accept injustice. That's the lesson here, girls. The system doesn't always work on its own. Sometimes it needs people with courage to make it work. Sometimes it needs 2 10-year-old girls who love their grandmother enough to stand up in a courtroom and demand the truth." They stood there for a while longer, the 3 of them, a family that had survived the worst and come out stronger. The sun was warm on their faces, and for the first time in months, Beatrice felt something close to peace. As they walked back to the car, Nola asked, "Grandma, what happened to Mr. Hartley?" "He's in prison now, where he belongs." "Do you hate him?" Zara asked. "For what he did to you?" Beatrice considered the question carefully. "No, baby. I don't hate him. I pity him. He had a good job, a good life, and he threw it all away because he made bad choices and then tried to blame someone else for them. That's a miserable way to live. And now he'll spend the next 12 years paying for those choices." "That's less than what he tried to do to you," Nola pointed out. "You're right. But I'm not in prison and I'm here with you too. That's justice enough for me." They drove home and Beatrice made them lunch, the same grilled cheese sandwiches she'd been making for them since they came to live with her. They ate at the kitchen table, talking about school, about their friends, about normal things. Normal, beautiful, everyday things that Beatrice had almost lost forever. That evening, after Zara and Nola were in bed, Beatrice sat in her living room, looking at the photographs on the wall. Pictures of her parents, long gone. Pictures of her daughter Michelle, forever young. Pictures of herself at various ages. Young and determined, middle-aged and successful, elderly but still fighting. She thought about her life, about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about being born in poverty, working her way through school, building a business when no one would hire her, losing her daughter, raising her granddaughters, nearly losing everything to a lie. But mostly she thought about that moment in the courtroom when Zara had stood up and said, "Please, Your Honor. Just let me speak." She thought about the courage that had taken, the pure, beautiful courage of two children who refused to let injustice win. The phone rang. It was her lawyer calling with more good news. Several of Gerald's victims, other clients who'd lost money, were getting restitution. The Bar Association was investigating the prosecutor's office for their failure to properly vet evidence. Changes were being made, reforms were being discussed. Good things, all of them. But Beatrice knew the truth. The system had almost destroyed an innocent woman. It had almost torn apart a family. It had almost worked exactly the way it was designed to work for people who looked like her, who came from where she came from. The only reason it hadn't was because two little girls had been brave enough and desperate enough and loved their grandmother enough to fight back. Before you go, I want you to think about something. Think about how many Beatrices are out there right now, people who've been wrongly accused, wrongly convicted, people whose families don't have two courageous granddaughters to fight for them. Think about how often the system fails, how often justice is just a word we say but don't deliver. Now, I want to ask you a question and I really want you to think about this and let me know in the comments. If you were Zara and Nola, would you have had the courage to stand up in that courtroom? Would you have spoken up even though you were just a kid and nobody was expecting you to? What would you have done differently, or would you have done the same thing? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I genuinely want to know what you think about this. 6 months after Beatrice's exoneration, Judge Randall Blackwood made an unexpected announcement. He was stepping down from the bench, not in disgrace but by choice. He'd been a judge for 23 years and he'd realized in that courtroom, watching two 10-year-old girls fight for justice with more passion than he'd shown in years, that he'd lost something essential. He'd become so focused on procedure, on precedent, on moving cases through the system efficiently, that he'd forgotten why the system existed in the first place. In his final statement from the bench, he said something that made headlines. "I've sentenced hundreds of people in my career. I've always believed I was being fair, following the law, serving justice. But I wonder now how many of them were innocent. How many of them didn't have two granddaughters to fight for them? How many of them I failed because I was too busy following procedures to seek the truth?" He'd started working with organizations focused on criminal justice reform, on exonerating the wrongly convicted, on fixing the broken parts of a system that had almost destroyed an innocent woman. Beatrice watched his announcement on the news, Zara and Nola sitting beside her. When it was over, Nola said, "Do you think he's a good person now?" Beatrice thought about it. "I think he's trying to be better. I think that's all any of us can do. We make mistakes, we learn from them, and we try to do better." "But he almost sent you to prison," Zara said. "Doesn't that make him bad?" "It makes him human," Beatrice said. "We're all carrying biases, all making assumptions, all capable of doing harm even when we think we're doing good. What matters is whether we're willing to recognize that and change." The girls thought about this. They were older now, not much older, but they'd lived through something that had aged them in ways that couldn't be measured in years. They understood now that the world was complicated, that good people could do bad things, that justice required constant vigilance, constant fighting. A year after the trial, Washington and Associates was thriving again. Beatrice had hired 2 new accountants, both young black women fresh out of college, giving them the opportunity she'd had to fight for decades ago. She'd also started a scholarship fund in her daughter's name, helping students from underserved communities pursue careers in accounting and finance. Zara and Nola were 11 now. They were doing well in school, making friends, healing from the trauma of almost losing their grandmother. But they'd also changed. They'd learned that they had power, that their voices mattered, that courage could change outcomes. Zara had started a journal, documenting everything that had happened. She said she wanted to write a book someday, wanted to tell their story in her own words. Nola had become interested in law, talking about maybe becoming a lawyer when she grew up, fighting for people the way they'd fought for their grandmother. Beatrice watched them grow, watched them learn, watched them become the incredible young women they were destined to be. And every night, when she tucked them into bed, she whispered the same thing. "Thank you for saving me. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for being exactly who you are." But here's the thing that stays with me about this story, the thing that keeps me up at night thinking about it. Zara and Nola saved their grandmother. They stood up, they fought back, they demanded justice, and they won. That's beautiful. That's inspiring. That's the kind of story that makes you believe in the power of courage and truth. But what about all the Beatrices who don't have granddaughters to fight for them? What about all the innocent people who get convicted because the evidence was manipulated, because someone lied, because the system made assumptions based on who they were rather than what they did? What about all the families that get torn apart because justice failed and there was no one brave enough or desperate enough or knowledgeable enough to stop it? Beatrice Washington was lucky. She was innocent, and she had two incredible granddaughters who refused to accept injustice. But how many people are in prison right now, serving time for crimes they didn't commit, with no one fighting for them? How many families have been destroyed because the system we're supposed to trust got it wrong? That's what this story is really about. It's not just about two girls saving their grandmother. It's about how fragile justice is, how easily it can fail, how much it depends on people having the courage to fight for it. Beatrice Washington spent 56 years building a business, serving her community, doing everything right. And in a matter of weeks, a lie almost destroyed it all. That's terrifying. That should terrify all of us. Because if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. The lesson here isn't just that courage matters, though it does. The lesson isn't just that we should fight for truth, though we should. The lesson is that we can't take justice for granted. We can't assume the system works. We can't trust that the truth will win just because it's the truth. Justice requires constant vigilance. It requires people who are willing to question authority, to challenge assumptions, to stand up even when they're scared, even when they're just 10-year-old girls with no power except their love for their grandmother and their unwavering belief in what's right. Beatrice Washington is 83 now. She's still working, still raising her granddaughters, still living the life she almost lost. When people ask her about what happened, about the trial, about almost going to prison, she always says the same thing: I'm grateful. I'm grateful I had Zara and Nola. I'm grateful for every day I get to spend with them. I'm grateful that sometimes, just sometimes, courage wins. But then she adds quietly, but I think about all the people who weren't as lucky as me. And that's what keeps me up at night. 3 years after the trial, on a cold winter morning, Beatrice received a letter. It was from a woman named Dorothy, who'd been in prison for 15 years for a crime she didn't commit. She'd read about Beatrice's story, about Zara and Nola's courage, and it had given her hope. She'd kept fighting, kept appealing, kept insisting on her innocence. And finally, new evidence had emerged and she'd been exonerated. The letter said, "Your granddaughters saved you. But they also saved me because they reminded me that we can't give up, we can't stop fighting, we can't let injustice win. Thank you for raising them to be brave. Thank you for teaching them that truth matters." Beatrice read that letter to Zara and Nola. By the time she finished, all three of them were crying. "We didn't even know her," Nola said. "How did we save her?" "You showed her that fighting back matters," Beatrice said. "You showed her that courage can change things. You showed her that she wasn't alone in believing that justice should actually mean justice." Zara was quiet for a moment, then said, "Grandma, how many people are in prison right now who didn't do what they were convicted of?" Beatrice didn't have an answer. Nobody did. The number was too high, whatever it was. One innocent person in prison is too many. One family torn apart by injustice is too many. One life destroyed by a system that failed is too many. "I don't know, baby," Beatrice said finally. "But I know that every single one of them matters. Every single one of them deserves someone to fight for them the way you fought for me." That conversation changed something in the girls. They were 13 now, old enough to understand the weight of injustice, young enough to still believe they could change it. They started volunteering with Innocence Projects, organizations that work to exonerate the wrongly convicted. They used their story, their platform, their voices to advocate for reform. They wrote letters to lawmakers, appeared at hearings, told their story over and over again to anyone who would listen. They weren't just the girls who saved their grandmother anymore. They were activists, advocates, voices for people who'd been silenced by a broken system. And Beatrice watched them, proud and heartbroken at the same time. Proud because they were using their experience to help others. Heartbroken because they'd had to go through that experience in the first place. Heartbroken because they were 13 years old and already carrying the weight of knowing how easily justice can fail. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you angry or inspired or hopeful, then do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Because there are so many stories like this that need to be told, so many voices that need to be heard, so many injustices that need to be exposed. And the only way we can keep telling these stories, the only way we can keep shining a light on these issues, is if people like you are paying attention, sharing these stories, refusing to look away. This isn't just entertainment. These are real lives, real families, real injustices. And the more people who know about them, the harder it becomes for the system to ignore them. On Beatrice's 85th birthday, her community threw her a celebration. Hundreds of people came. Former clients, friends, people whose lives she'd touched over the years, people who'd heard her story and been inspired by it. Zara and Nola, now 15 years old, stood up to give a speech. They talked about their grandmother, about her strength, about her grace, about everything she'd taught them. But they also talked about the system that had almost destroyed her, about the Gerald Hartleys of the world who exploit that system, about the Judge Blackwoods who mean well but don't always see clearly. Our grandmother taught us that you fight for what's right, Zara said. But she also taught us that fighting isn't always enough. You need courage, yes. But you also need a system that listens, that cares, that actually seeks truth instead of just processing cases. Nola continued, we saved our grandmother because we got lucky. Because Judge Blackwood decided to listen to two kids when he didn't have to. Because we happened to have access to the evidence we needed. Because everything aligned just right. But not everyone gets lucky like that. And that's not okay. They finished together, so we're not just grateful our grandmother is here. We're committed to making sure that other families don't have to get lucky. We're committed to fixing a system that's broken. We're committed to fighting until justice isn't just a word, but a reality for everyone. The crowd erupted in applause. Beatrice stood there, tears streaming down her face, looking at these two incredible young women who'd once been two terrified little girls holding hands in a courtroom, refusing to let injustice win. That night, after everyone had gone home, after the candles had been blown out and the gifts had been opened, Beatrice sat with Zara and Nola in their living room. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of quiet that only comes when you're with people who truly love you. Girls, Beatrice said, I need to tell you something. I need to thank you, really thank you for what you did. You saved my life. But more than that, you saved my faith. I was starting to believe that the world didn't work the way I'd always told your mother it worked, the way I'd always told you it worked. I was starting to think that maybe justice was just a fairy tale we told ourselves to feel better. She paused, wiping her eyes. But you proved me wrong. You showed me that justice is real, but it's not automatic. It doesn't just happen. It requires people who are willing to fight for it, people who refuse to accept injustice even when everyone else has given up. You were those people. At 10 years old, you were those people. Zara took her grandmother's hand. You taught us to be those people, Grandma. Everything we did, we learned from watching you. You spent your whole life fighting, building, refusing to give up even when the world tried to keep you down. We just did what you've been showing us how to do our entire lives. Nola nodded. And we're not done fighting. There are still too many people like you, innocent people who need someone to fight for them. So we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep telling stories, keep pushing for reform, keep making noise until the system changes. Beatrice pulled them both close, holding them tight. I love you both so much. I'm so proud of who you are. I'm so grateful I got to raise you. I'm so glad I got to see the incredible people you're becoming. They sat there, the three of them, a family forged in tragedy and strengthened by injustice and held together by love. They'd survived the worst. They'd fought back against a system designed to destroy them. They'd won. But they knew the fight wasn't over. It never would be. Because justice isn't something you achieve once and then stop thinking about. Justice is something you have to fight for every single day, in every single case, for every single person who deserves it. That's the real lesson of Beatrice Washington, Zara Johnson, and Nola Johnson. That's the story that matters. Two 10-year-old girls stood up in a federal courtroom and demanded justice when every adult in the room was ready to let injustice slide by. They didn't have power, they didn't have money, they didn't have legal expertise. All they had was courage and love and an absolute refusal to accept that their grandmother would be punished for something she didn't do. And somehow, impossibly, beautifully, it was enough. In the face of bias and injustice, courage and determination didn't just matter. They changed everything. They saved a life. They saved a family. They reminded everyone watching that justice is worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible, even when you're just a kid with a backpack full of documents and a heart full of hope. So remember Beatrice. Remember Zara and Nola. Remember that the system doesn't always work, but people can make it work if they're brave enough to try. Remember that your voice matters, that truth matters, that fighting back matters. Remember that justice isn't just about laws and courts and procedures. It's about people who care enough to stand up and say, this is wrong and I won't accept it. Be those people. Be like Zara and Nola. Be brave enough to fight for what's right, even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when everyone tells you you can't win. Because sometimes, just sometimes, you can.